We're live, we're recording. Hi everyone, hope everyone is well. I'm going to share my screen in a second so you can see some of the sources that I'm going to be talking about. So just bear with me while I do that. Should be coming on right now. Can everyone see the screen? Nod. Okay, great. So today we're going to be talking for a few minutes about Ruth. We read Megillat Ruth on Shavuot. And Ruth is somebody who I think does not really get enough credit. She is a woman who, we always talk about other women, I think, in biblical canon. We talk a lot about Esther, we talk a lot about Miriam. And Ruth, yes, we know that she was famous for converting and she was famous for being modest, etc., etc. But there's a lot of nuances about her personality that I think are often skipped over that I'd like to address today. Obviously, we've only got 10 minutes, so I'm going to try and stick to my time, and I'm going to go very quickly over them. But all of this can be discussed in much greater detail. So the first thing I want to look at is the first source. The first source comes directly from the Megillat Ruth. And this is the time when Boaz talks about Ruth, and he calls her this famous phrase, because Ruth throughout the Megillah is called many things. She's called a maidservant, she's called a daughter-in-law, she's called a wife, she's called a woman, she's called a Moabite. But the nicest phrase she's ever given is this one over here, an Eshet Chayil, a fine woman. Now, Eshet Chayil, we sing this song every Friday night in some homes, and often it's translated as a woman of valor. It's a very strange translation, and there's not really a great translation. And if you want to understand what the word Eshet Chayil, this word Chayil means, Eshet means obviously a wife or a woman, we have to go back to another time in the Torah when it was used to understand what compliment is Boaz giving Ruth at this particular time. So if you go in the Torah, you'll see that the next source over here, in Shemot, in the book of Shemot, we have Moshe choosing men to help him to lead the Jewish people. And he calls them, rather than Eshet Chayil, we now have Anshe Chayil, men of valor, capable men, they use the translation here. And the commentators explain that when it refers to Chayil in this context, he's talking about professional men, rich people, people who are the top end of society, people who are doing very well financially. And they're the people who Moshe chose to help to lead the Jewish people. And what's so weird is that how can that word be used for these men and also be used for Ruth? Ruth is somebody who left Moab. She was a Moabite princess. She had all the money, all the materialism, living in a big palace, and she left it all to become a pauper. She had no money. She had nothing. How can she be called a woman of finance, a woman of means? Doesn't make any sense. So the Ibn Ezra, who is a Sephardi commentator, he says, no. Doesn't mean that she was wealthy. Doesn't mean that she was a professional. What it means is that she had financial independence. She had savviness. She had financial acumen. What did Ruth do? If you look at the next source down here, again, this teaches us a lot about Ruth as a person. She says to Boaz, please let me glean and gather the sheaves. Basically, I want to work. I know that I can't just expect handouts from God. I know that things are not just going to come my way. I have to have financial savviness to be able to get up and do something for myself. And in Hebrew, we call this hishtadlut, not to wait around for people just to drop things in your hands, to get up and to do something. Now imagine, again, being a princess, and she then sunk down to the level of picking up bits of wheat from the floor. But she was willing to do that because she knew that she had to get on with life. She couldn't just wait around for people just to give her handouts. And this is something very, very interesting that we see about Ruth as a person. She was someone that, and this is what Boaz, who was going to be her husband, saw in her. Boaz was the judge at the time, the leader at the time, and he needed a wife who was going to be independent. He didn't want someone clinging on to him, like a wife who was just going to be there to look pretty. He needed a wife that could be strong and independent. And this is what he saw in her at this time. Now, if we go down over here, this is a scenario which is very, very strange. Over here is another characteristic that we see of Ruth. Ruth, at this point, is told by her mother-in-law, Naomi, that she has to go down to the threshing floor, it says, and basically seduce Boaz. It's a very, very strange, there's lots of talk about it, not for now, very strange situation of what's going on. And what does Naomi say? She says, Boaz is going to be winnowing barley. Then she gives her instructions, very specific instructions. She says, bathe, anoint yourself, dress up, and then go down to the threshing floor, and then basically seduce him. It's very strange, because what does she actually do? 3 verses later, in Vav, over here, it says, she went down to her threshing floor and did just as her mother-in-law had instructed. But if we go back to here, it's the wrong way around. What was she meant to do first? She was meant to make herself look pretty and then go down, but she didn't. She went down first, dressed as she was before, and only once she was down there did she get dressed and make herself look beautiful. And the commentators pick up on this, and they ask why. And Rashi actually over here, we're not going to go into it inside, but Rashi picks up on it. He says basically, she did not want to look like a prostitute, a harlot, he calls it. He says she understood. Imagine the leader of the Jewish people having a woman coming dressed to the nines, coming to visit him. Wouldn't really give the best impression, would it? People would not really look very favorably upon him. And Ruth understood the sensitivity of being the leader of the people. She did not want anyone to think badly of this, her potential husband, of this leader of the people. So she decided to change the order, to go down dressed as a normal person. And when she was down there out of sight and no one could see her, then she dressed up and she made herself look nice. But what did she not do? She didn't turn around to Naomi, her mother-in-law, say, "You stupid old woman, what are you talking about? I'm not going to do that. People are going to think badly of him." She didn't belittle her. She didn't say anything to her mother-in-law. She just did it quietly. She just went and did her own thing. And then it says specifically, she did just as her mother-in-law had instructed her. She was so sensitive and so respectful to her mother-in-law, who she had no reason to be respectful to, because really, what had her mother-in-law done for her, really? There was no reason for her to be that respectful towards her. Ruth was the one looking after Naomi after all. But she had such sensitivity that she did not want for a second for Naomi to feel that she had gone the other way, that done anything differently. So this has 2 very important things here. And this again refers back to this word up here. We spoke about chayil, eshet chayil, a woman of valor, a woman of whatever, however we want to translate it. Because when we think of the word chayil, chayil reminds us in Hebrew of chayal, a soldier, chayalim, the soldiers of the Israeli army. And the idea of being courageous like a soldier, the commentators explain that Ruth was very, very courageous for going down and making herself so vulnerable in this situation to basically go to Boaz and beg to be his husband, her wife, his wife. That's the way. So that number one, we see a courageous side of her. But on the same pasuk, the same few verses, we also see that she's exceptionally sensitive. She's exceptionally respectful to people closest to her. And I think my time's nearly already up, so I'm going to finish on this note. There's much more to say, but I'm going to finish on this. I think this is a message actually that I think that we can all take from the Megillah, especially for the time that we're living in right now. We're told that the Megillah was taught to us, or we read it on Shavuot, to teach us about kindness. And it's very strange because we learn lots of things from the Megillah. We learn about the laws of conversion. We learn about the laws of marriage, the laws of modesty, all these things. Why does the Midrash say specifically we read the Megillah only to teach us about being kind? And I think part of the reason is because often it's easy to be kind to people who we're going to be thanked for. It's easy to be kind to people who are going to say, "Thank you for doing that for me. I really appreciate it. I really appreciate you picking up the shopping for me. I know it was really difficult. I really appreciate you phoning me," or whatever the situation is. So that is kindness, and it is very kind to do, and it's the right thing to do. But the hard part of being kind is being kind to people who are closest to you, people who necessarily we may live with, people who are in our immediate family. Because in this situation, Naomi and Ruth were living together. They were the closest to each other, and I'm sure they got on each other's nerves like crazy. But we see in this situation that she was so respectful in how she behaved so that she wouldn't upset her mother-in-law, to the person who she lived with and spent the most amount of time with. And in this situation that we're all in now, with being quarantined, maybe be with other people or not with other people, it's very, very difficult when we're living in such close quarters with people, not being able to do our day-to-day thing. And I'm sure we all find that we're all snapping at people when we wouldn't normally be doing so. And I think this is a message that we can all learn from Roots, to try, as amazing as it is to be kind to people outside of our family, to try even harder to be extra especially sensitive to those who are in our own home or in our immediate family. And on that, I'm going to end. I think it's already been my time. So Chag Sameach, everyone. And yes, I'm going to stop sharing the screen now to go back. And I'm going to leave you, Rabbi Lionel. Chag Sameach.
Shkoch Emma, kol hakavod. Profound and enjoyable as always. Okay, so now I'm going. Rabbi Lionel, you're on.
Yes, no questions from Emma first.
We'll do all three and we'll do questions at the end. It's better for the it fits the recording better.
So I'm sorry, I can't put out on any. I had some obviously places I've taken from, but I don't have a printer with me, so you're going to have to bear with me just talking it through. You know, everybody knows what the customs of Shavuot are. We all know we have to eat have dairy foods, and we put greens and plants in the synagogue. If I have time, I'll touch on that. But I really was very interested. As you know, on Pesach, we have on Passover at the Seder, there's so many different customs around the Jewish world. Everybody does something different at their Seder. And I wanted to look in customs in older communities. And communities around the world, how do they celebrate Shavuot? After all, you know, Shavuot is nearly a non-festival, I have to say, for a huge percentage of our congregation. You know, even when we are all together, they don't turn up. It's hardly mentioned, people forget. And yet there are some wonderful customs which keep communities together. So let me start with Germany and let me tell you a few of them. I'm going to start with Germany. I'm going to end with Greece, actually, which is phenomenal. On Shavuot, it was the custom in Mainz, one of the main centers of Torah learning, to bake, actually, Mainz is northern France, sorry, it's not Germany, to bake specially sweetened challahs, and they were called Sinai. Why were they called Sinai? Because on that day, children began the study of the Torah. It's the season of receiving the Torah. We connect Shavuot to the Ten Commandments and standing at Sinai. And the receiving of the Torah was to be made sweet for them. That's how you bring children in. And in fact, it was the custom to begin teaching the Torah to children on Shavuot, because the Torah was given on that day. And at dawn, children were taken to the synagogue, because it says, Vayhi b'yom hashlishi. When did it happen? At Sinai, in the book of Shemot. It was on the third day, at the coming of the morning. And a tablet would be brought on which the letters of the alphabet were written, and a few verses like Moses commanded us the Torah, stuff, basic things that we would learn in first weeks of Cheder, and the first verse of Leviticus, Vayikra, which traditionally, even though it's the third book and it's all about sacrifices, children were used to begin with that. And the teacher would read every letter, and the child would repeat after him. Doesn't say a her in those days, I suppose all the teachers were men. And then the teacher would put a little bit of honey on the tablet, and the child would lick the honey from the letters. Now in our days, of course, with health and safety, it wouldn't be allowed, but in those days, they didn't seem to catch any virus. And on a special honey cake, they were to write verses from the Torah and on a boiled egg. A boiled egg in those days was a luxury. And if a child got a boiled egg, he was very happy to get it. And the teacher would read everything on the tablet, on the cake, and then the egg. And after the children have finished their lesson, they're given the cake and the egg to eat. And when they're taken from their houses to the house of the teacher, they were wrapped in a talit or some special covering, because it says they stood at the bottom of the mountain when they received Sinai, and they would have had, the mountain was like a cover over them. You see, so, and then they would bring the child to the edge of the river, because the Torah is compared to water, because it says, may your well springs overflow outward. And the cake, finally, is made with much honey and milk, because it's written, honey and milk are under your tongue. That's from the Song of Songs, and honey and milk are compared to the sweetness of Torah, and milk, of course, is the Torah itself. It's the staff of life, and it's the Torah. So that was a beautiful custom they used to have in northern France. And similarly, in Frankfurt, it was the custom to take a specially prepared milk dish or meat dish, fashioned like a ladder with 7 steps, in memory of the 7 heavens, which God opened for Israel at the time of the giving of the Torah. There's this Kabbalistic idea that also when we pass on, our soul goes through 7 celestial heavens. And the point of the Kaddish, by the way, is to help the soul ascend to the highmost heaven. So there is something about that also. But I want to end with the last few minutes that I've got to talk about Salonika. You know, Salonika was called the Queen of Israel. Saloniki in Greece was one of the greatest Jewish cities that ever existed. It was a real melting pot of Jewish communities, because where it was situated, they would come from Turkey and from Europe, Northern Europe and Eastern Europe. And it was also a huge trade hub and a haven for Jews following the expulsions from Spain and Portugal in 1492. That's where they went. And it was a very cosmopolitan Jewish community where Spanish and Portuguese Jews could again maintain their Sephardic traditions and their customs. What was one of those customs on Shavuot? The baking of rich dairy yeast breads, which was called El Pan de Siete Cielos. That's in Ladino. The bread, guess what? Of the 7 heavens. So we go from northern France to Greece, and we have the bread of the 7 heavens. And for 780 years, this was the signature dish of the Jews of Salonika and the Shavuot festival. And they continued to bake that bread all the way from 1492 until World War II, when, of course, the Nazis almost entirely exterminated them. And there's only a handful of survivors who can recall eating the bread at their festival tables, and the tradition has really nearly gone. But it was a golden age for Jews all the way through, especially in the 18th century. And why did they bake these breads? Well, think when Shavuot came, you had Pesach and Easter, and then you had what they call Ascension Day in Christianity. And at Easter, the Christian neighbors began baking their own bread. After all, they had abstained during the period of Lent. And when they came after Lent, they had breads full of rich ingredients. And for once, the Jews copied the Christians. And because on Shavuot, you eat dairy meals, so they baked bread. First of all, they took a ball of dough and they shaped it like Mount Sinai, where God gave us the Torah. And then they ringed what they called Mount Sinai with 7 ropes of dough, meaning the clouds surrounding the mountain and those 7 celestial heavens. But I thought about this, I think it's a direct reference to the word Shavuot, which means weeks. Why weeks? Because we've counted 7 weeks from the second night of Pesach through the Omer until we get to Shavuot. So it must have been that, I think, that gave these 7 rings between Lent or Pesach or Easter and Shavuot. And there was another common image. You had a Torah scroll with a Torah pointer, the Yad. What did that represent? That represented all the written teachings and the oral teachings which God gave Moses on Mount Sinai. And then you had Jacob's ladder, because the ladder went up to heaven. And finally, you had Miriam's well in the desert. That well gave sustenance. All these things were made into beautiful breads. And let me end with a story which a 19th century musician, Saadi Besalel Alevi, describing the scene in Salonika during the last century of the Ottoman Empire. He said, on Shavuot, my father would go after dinner to attend a study session according to the custom of all the Jews. That's the Tikkun Leil, which unfortunately we can't hold this year. When they all went to the synagogues and no one stayed at home. They were all in shul. And that time of the year, he said, nights were short and the dawn broke early. Some people would come back home to eat the cheese pies, enkuza, with some rice pudding, something else called sotiach. And then they'd go to sleep until about 1 or 2 o'clock. Others went touring the parks, and listen to this. The lower class people with wicker baskets filled up to the top with cheese pies, rice pudding, and hard-boiled eggs and liquor. The sort of people, unfortunately, you remember we always used to have at the Kiddush some unfortunate people who came to the Kiddush and filled up their pockets or their bags from the Kiddush, and we all always feel sorry for them. But these were the lower class people who went around, took all the foods, went with their families to the outskirts of the city to eat, get drunk, fall asleep on the grass, and then he writes, most of them returned home quite sick. So that has how Shavuot was spent in Saloniki in Greece. And I'd like to think that we all have our own customs, but when it comes to it, we all have the Torah at Sinai. We all try to stay and learn something. All our members give of their best. You, Francis, and Mary, and Jamie, always, everybody who helps out on those evenings when we have a wonderful study session. We all do that. And then some of us go to sleep, some of us stay up, but we all look at Shavuot as something, not as a simple, small festival breaking up the summer, but something that we can all enjoy, relate to, and bring the Torah back into our own homes. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi Lionel. Always wonderful, always interesting, and we always learn something new. So thank you. Okay, now over to me. So Emma spoke about Megillat Ruth. Rabbi Lionel spoke about the customs of Shavuot. I'm going to speak about the Torah reading for the first day of Shavuot, which comes from Exodus, Shemot, chapters 19 and 20. But I want to focus on one particular phrase. So prior to the Jewish people being given the 10 Commandments, we are told in chapter 19, verse 17, we are told, and the Jewish people stood under the mountain. What does it mean they stood under the mountain, right? So Rashi gives one of two possible explanations. I've quoted this Rashi in the past, but I'm going to take it in a different direction. What does Rashi say? Rashi gives two possible explanations. What does it mean the Jewish people stood underneath the mountain? So option number one is V'raglei Ahar. They just stood at the foot of the mountain, next to the mountain. They were near the mountain. They were eager to receive the Torah. They were just waiting there, right, in the vicinity. That's where they were. That's the simple understanding, says Rashi. But Rashi says something else. He quotes a Medrash, and this passage from the sages is also quoted in the Gemara in Tractate Shabbat and Tractate Avodah Zarah. And the Medrash says this. What happens? Shenitlash hahar mimkomo, that the mountain was picked up from its place, the nichpa alehem, and it was held over them. It was held over the Jewish people, kigigit, like a tub or like a vat. What's going on here? What's Rashi getting at? So before we analyze this, let's just, I need to paint the bigger picture. I need to just explain to you the whole Gemara, the whole passage, so you know what's going on. So the nations of the world, they approach the Almighty and they say, it's not fair, the Jewish people will in the time to come, in the Messianic era, the Jewish people are going to be rewarded. And the non-Jewish, the other nations, the nation of the world, approach Hashem and they say, it's not fair. We also want to be rewarded. And Hashem says, no, you oppress the Jewish people, you're not going to get rewarded. And then some nations say, well, we weren't nice to Jewish people. Well, then Hashem says, well, you only did it because it was good for you, didn't do it for the real reasons, right? And then the nation of the world go back to Hashem and say, well, the Jewish people, they only accepted the Torah out of force, because look what happened, right? Hashem, you forced them, you took the mountain, you uprooted it, you held it over their head, you forced them to receive the Torah. Therefore, they shouldn't be rewarded because they didn't accept the Torah out of love. They accepted it because they had no option, because you forced them to do it. So the Gemara finishes off by saying that, yes, you're right. Originally, the Jewish people accepted the Torah out of force. But in the Purim story, they re-accepted it out of love. So for that reason, you nation of the world, you don't have a claim, and therefore the Jewish people should be rewarded appropriately, and the other nations won't be in the time to come. So that's what the Gemara says. That's what the passage says. That's So just so we understand exactly what is going on. But the question is, what are we meant to learn from this image? Again, the idea that the mountain, Mount Sinai, was uprooted and was turned over, and it was held over the heads of Klal Yisrael, it was held over the heads of the Jewish people, and only then did they accept the Torah. How can we understand this? And I think there are two important messages that we see from this passage. Passage number one that we learn from this passage. Lesson number one is this: the Jewish people were forced to accept the Torah. Why? Because it was a matter of life or death, right? Literally, if they wouldn't have accepted it, Hashem would have dropped the mountain and they would have died, right? That's what the passage says. So here we see that so too with us. Torah, Judaism, our faith, is a matter of life or death. It's something we should take seriously. It's something that we should really hold close to our heart. It's interesting because in the past few months, we've been at home, the coronavirus, we've really learned what's important in life. And there's been a Pew report recently that said that during this whole coronavirus period, people have become closer to their faith. People have moved closer to religion. So we've seen what really matters to us. So this passage was telling us, literally, Torah, it's a matter of life or death. This is what's really important. That's what we have realized over the past few months. That's what people of faith have realized over the last 2 months, that faith is important, that faith really is a matter of life or death, and faith really is something which matters far more than what maybe we previously would have thought. And this has been one of the secrets of Jewish survival, that we've always taken our faith seriously. I came across a beautiful article today, actually, which demonstrates this. In 1865, the American Jewish community had a real dilemma. Why did I put in 1865? Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, and the president at the time, President Johnson, called, and we, not related to Boris Johnson, but President Johnson at the time called for a national day of mourning because Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, and everyone in every house of worship should mourn and should say appropriate prayers. The problem with this was that this day, which was set aside as a day of mourning, was Shavuot in 1865. So the question is, how should the Jewish people respond? On the one hand, they want to be loyal to the government and the laws of the country, but on the other hand, right, they take their faith very seriously. So how do they go about doing that? So there were two big rabbis. One rabbi was the rabbi in Philadelphia and Mikveh, Israel, the Spanish Portuguese shul, which exists to this day. He said that we should observe Shavuot, meaning we shouldn't violate any of the negative the negative mitzvot. We should still observe this day, and we should say we should be in mourning, but without violating the negative prohibitions of Shavuot. Right, that was his approach. The other approach by Rabbi Lyons, who was the rabbi in Shavuot, Israel, in New York, the other Spanish Portuguese shul. Right, see, even within the same community, they couldn't agree. But Rabbi Lyons in New York, in Shavuot, Israel, what did he say? He said, no, we should observe Shavuot the way we always do, but we should do something different this year. What should that be? During Yizkor, we should say a special prayer for Abraham Lincoln. So these whole approaches evolved. Why? Because everyone agreed that we should take our faith seriously. But the question is, how does that manifest itself in terms of that situation when Abraham Lincoln died and there was a national day of mourning? But anyway, that's the secret behind our survival. We've always taken our faith seriously. So that's the first message that we learn from the fact that we were literally forced to receive the Torah. What's the second message that we learn? And this answer is based on the Medrash, on a different Medrash in Shir HaShirim. Yonati b'chagvei hasela, says the pasuk. Basically, when it comes to a dove flies around and it's in the sun and it's goes about doing its daily business. But what happens is the dove sometimes, when it needs to find shade, where does it go? It goes into the cleft of a rock, and then a cleft of a rock, it's able to find shade. It's able to take a pause before going out into the big, wide world again. So, and that, in a similar way, that was what was happening here when the mountain was held over the Bnei Israel. Why? It was Sivan. It was a boiling day in the Sinai desert. What happened? Hashem lifted up the mountain and gave shade to the Jewish people, right? It was boiling. It was, very, very hot. It was unbearable, the heat, right? Hashem provided shade. And so too when it comes to the Torah. If we accept the Torah, we get shade, right? Not from sun, or maybe we do, or perhaps not so much in England. But we get shade from life by accepting Torah, by being part of our community, by doing our mitzvot, by doing our rituals, by living a Torah lifestyle, we get shade from life. Life becomes more doable. Life becomes more manageable. Life becomes more, it becomes more enjoyable, more wonderful, more simchadik, and that is what this image is also trying to teach us. Remember, we're meant to worship Hashem with simcha. Shabbos is something which is meant to be menucha v'simcha, but not just Shabbos. The whole of our faith should be something which is restful and peaceful and enjoyable. Remember, what does the famous verse in Tehillim say? Torah is better than money, right? Money people find enjoyable. Torah is meant to be even better than that, right? That's what Torah, that's what Judah is meant to be. It's meant to be enjoyable, peaceful. It's meant to be and by living such a life, again, it makes life more doable. It's like living in shade, but the best shade possible because it's provided by the Almighty. So therefore, we got this weird Rashi. What on earth is this Rashi trying to teach us? These two important lessons. Number one, this idea that we're meant to take Torah seriously. We're meant to really be committed to it. But number two, this idea that Torah and Judaism and Yiddishkeit is meant to make life more manageable, more doable, more relaxing, right? And that's also what this Rashi is meant to be teaching us. And it's no coincidence that when do we read this verse? On Shavuot, which is the very day when we received the Torah. So now we understand this Rashi. Now we understand why I read it on Shavuot. Now we understand these two messages which are important for us to consider. Chag Sameach to you all.